welcome to the deep dive. We are really so glad you could join us today.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a second, because we know exactly why you are tuning in right now. You are someone who is actively looking to cut through the just the absolute noise and the endless spin of the modern media landscape.
Right, the mainstream platitudes.
Exactly. You are intensely curious about the actual history of our foundational institutions. Specifically, you want to understand what those institutions looked like and how they actually functioned before they were captured by what many argue are feminist and Marxist ideologies.
This is a huge topic.
It is massive. You are watching the intense cultural shifts happening right now around modern masculinity, and you want a thorough, unfiltered map of these arguments. And that is exactly what we are giving you today.
We are getting right into it.
But before we get started, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show. It really, really helps us out and ensures you never miss a deep dive.
Definitely do that.
Today's show is a comprehensive review of a provocative, ultra-long, incisive, and frankly fascinating new ebook. I highly encourage you to hook yourself a copy. Go check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book for yourself. And make sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
It is an incredibly dense, highly detailed text we are exploring today. The book is Conrad Riker's 2025 ebook, Marxism in Knickers.
Quite the title.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive is to thoroughly and meticulously unpack the author's central thesis. Riker argues that Western institutions, which he claims were originally built on strict meritocracy, raw competence, and traditional masculine virtues, have been systematically captured.
Captured and reprogrammed.
Exactly. Reprogrammed and ultimately dismantled by Marxist and feminist ideologies. We're going to be looking at a massive amount of data, historical references, legal statistics, and societal critiques that the author uses to build this very specific case. Now, before we go a single step further, we have a mandatory and very important disclaimer to make to you, the listener. Very important.
Because this book contains highly politically charged content, touching heavily on left-wing and right-wing culture wars, feminism, men's rights activism, we must explicitly state that we are absolutely not taking sides today.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the conclusions of this content. Our job is simply to impartially report on the text, convey the ideas, lay out the statistics, and explore the arguments exactly as they are contained in the original source material.
We are just your guides to the text.
Nothing more, nothing less. Okay, let's unpack this. Riker spends a significant portion of the early chapters establishing what the world looked like before this ideological capture. He paints a picture of a society built entirely on merit and uncompromising physical reality. Walk us through the baseline he establishes here.
Well, he uses several very specific historical anchors to establish this baseline of a pre-captured society. For instance, he points to the Detroit auto unions and manufacturing plants of the 1950s.
Okay, why Detroit in the 50s?
Because Riker argues that in that specific era, promotions on the assembly line went to the absolute best machinist, period. It was an environment governed by the laws of physics and mechanical reality.
So if you could build an engine that worked perfectly, you advanced.
Yes, if you couldn't, you didn't. It was an environment where advancement was based on raw competence and merit, not on manufactured grievance, interpersonal politics, or diversity quotas.
Got it.
He uses this as a stark contrast to modern corporate culture, which he views as having entirely abandoned objective merit in favor of what he terms oppression-based advancement.
He also brings up Teddy Roosevelt as a sort of avatar for this lost era.
Oh, yeah.
He uses Roosevelt as the ultimate archetype of robust, unapologetic masculinity, pointing out that this was a man who led the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and essentially single-handedly created the national parks system.
A very active physical legacy.
Right. But Riker argues that modern institutions are actively attempting to rewrite or erase this exact type of history.
Precisely. Riker points directly at the Smithsonian Institution. He claims that the Smithsonian has allegedly recast Roosevelt's monumental conservation legacy as colonial or even eco-fascism.
Eco-fascism! That's a strong label.
According to Riker's analysis of their recent exhibits, these institutions now spend significantly more time critiquing Roosevelt's traditional masculinity, his love for hunting, and his expansionist worldview, than celebrating the fact that he preserved millions of acres of wilderness.
And Riker views this not as a mere historical update, I assume.
No, he views it as a deliberate, ideological erasure of male excellence. He argues that if you can make a society ashamed of the men who built it, You can easily dismantle the structures they left behind.
And he traces this concept that a civilization must actively cultivate tough masculine virtues to survive all the way back to antiquity. He spends a lot of time on the ancient Spartan agoge system.
He does.
For those who might only know the Hollywood version of Sparta, can you give us an ELI 5 and explain, like, I'm 5 on what the agoge actually was and how Riker applies it to his thesis?
Absolutely. The agoge was the rigorous state-sponsored education and training program mandated for all male Spartan citizens. From the age of 7, boys were removed from their homes and placed in communal barracks.
7 years old.
Yeah, very young. It was an incredibly brutal training regimen designed to forge young boys into resilient warriors through intense physical adversity, starvation, combat, and absolute discipline.
Okay, but Riker obviously isn't advocating for child abuse, right?
No. He uses the agoge as a historical metaphor. He argues that civilizations require a crucible of adversity to build what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility. Riker claims that modern educational systems do the exact opposite.
By wrapping kids in bubble wrap.
Basically, by eliminating dodgeball, banning tag, or pathologizing competitive play, we're shielding young men from the very adversity they need. He posits that civilizations require this hardened resilience to survive, and by dismantling the modern equivalent of the agoge, we're breeding societal fragility.
That brings us to one of the most surprising and fascinating parts of the book. Riker argues that it's not just our history books or our gym classes that are being altered. He argues that the actual physical world around us is literally being, in his words, castrated.
The architecture section.
Yes, I want to dig into his analysis of architecture. He compares classic architects like Frank Lloyd Wright to modernist architects like Zaha Hadid and Rem Koolhaas. How exactly does one emasculate a building?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker is arguing that architecture is never neutral. It always reflects the dominant ideology of the ruling class. He praises the majestic, vertical, imposing structures of the past.
Like skyscrapers.
Right. He looks at Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, traditional obelisks, or classic Art Deco skyscrapers as symbols of unapologetic masculine ambition, order, and stability. They conquer gravity and impose human will on nature.
And the modern architects.
He fiercely critiques them. He claims that architects like Hadid and Koolhaas design what he calls feminist utopias filled with gynecological, sweeping, or fluid aesthetics that lack structural hierarchy.
Gynecological architecture. That is certainly a phrase. But he actually uses material science to back up this aesthetic critique, right?
Yes, he doesn't just leave it at visual preference. He cites a Cambridge material science report claiming that traditional masculine designed buildings, which prioritize load-bearing right angles and brutalist structural integrity, have a 37% longer lifespan than these modern fluid designs.
37% is a massive difference.
And he says these deconstructed designs often suffer from chronic leaking, structural fatigue, and immense maintenance costs. For Riker, the sterilization and fluidization of our city skylines is a literal, visual representation of society's emasculation. The form no longer follows function. The form follows ideology.
And he points out that when corporations try to push this ideology onto the consumer, the market violently rejects it. The biggest example he unpacks is the infamous 2019 Gillette Toxic Masculinity ad campaign.
Oh, that was a huge cultural flashpoint.
Riker claims that by lecturing their own customer base and portraying ordinary traditional male behavior like boys wrestling or men approaching women as problematic and toxic, Procter & Gamble suffered an $8 billion loss in market value.
That Gillette campaign is a cornerstone of his corporate critique. Riker frames this as men successfully voting with their wallets. He argues that corporations have been captured by HR departments that are completely disconnected from the actual consumer base.
They alienated their core demographic.
Exactly. When Gillette decided to act as a moral scold rather than a razor company, they alienated the very demographic that kept them in business.
But Riker argues this reprogramming isn't just visual or corporate, it's sensory. He dedicates a whole chapter to what he calls audio neutering. He claims that every sensory input is being engineered to make men docile. Walk me through his arguments about music, movies, and electric vehicles.
It is a remarkably comprehensive worldview. He argues that modern pop music has been intentionally stripped of deep, aggressive bass.
Structurally removed.
Yes. He cites military psychological studies linking heavy bass and rhythmic percussion to heightened aggression, adrenaline production, and warrior cohesion. Riker claims that the modern music industry heavily pushes high treble, effeminate synth beats, and whisper vocals.
He mentions The Weeknd, I think.
He does, pointing to artists like The Weeknd as examples of this vocal shift toward a softer, less threatening male presence. Furthermore, he claims Hollywood sound engineers are actively lowering the vocal pitches of male villains.
Wait, so he's saying Hollywood is training us to fear deep voices?
Exactly. According to Riker, by consistently pairing the deepest, most resonant male voices with the antagonists, audiences are being subconsciously conditioned to associate natural, high-testosterone male voices with danger, oppression, and evil, while the heroes often have softer, more varied, or higher-pitched deliveries.
And the electric vehicles.
He complains that the visceral, chest-thumping roar of a combustion V8 engine, a sound he views as inherently masculine and powerful, is being replaced. He cites an instance where Mercedes allegedly hired Foley artists to design what he literally refers to as vaginal white noise for their electric vehicle.
Yeah, vaginal white noise.
Yes, ensuring the cars hum harmlessly rather than roar.
That is a staggering way to view the world, where every building curve and car engine sound is part of an ideological war. But Riker argues that this cultural reprogramming inevitably leaks into the most foundational units of society. If the culture softens men up, the legal system goes in for the kill.
Which brings us to family court.
This is where he transitions to his extensive data on the family court system. And he does not mince words. He refers to the family law system as an extortion racket and a debtor's prison for men. What is the data he is looking at here?
The statistical picture he paints is quite stark. He cites U.S. Census Bureau data and various legal meta-analyses suggesting that mothers win primary custody in anywhere from 82% to 92% of contested cases.
And Riker is very careful to point out that this statistic holds true even when fathers are actively fighting in court for 50-50 shared parenting.
Yes, it's not just men walking away. Furthermore, he notes that men pay 97% of all alimony in the United States.
And how does Riker explain this disparity? Does he view it as a quirk of the legal system or something deeper?
He argues that this isn't an accident, but the result of systemic ideological bias rooted in legal relics. Specifically, he targets the 19th century tender years doctrine.
Can we pause there for an ELI 5? What exactly was the tender years doctrine, and how does a 19th century law apply to a divorce court today?
Certainly. The tender years doctrine was a legal principle established in the 1800s that presumed mothers were inherently, biologically, and naturally better caregivers for young children in their tender years.
Okay.
Before this doctrine, custody generally went to fathers because children were viewed under English common law almost as property of the patriarchal estate. The tender years doctrine flipped this, creating a legal presumption of maternal custody.
But that's not on the books anymore, is it?
Officially, most modern jurisdictions have formally abolished this doctrine in favor of the gender-neutral best interests of the child standard. However, Riker's argument is that the ghost of the tender years doctrine still actively infects modern family court judges.
Ah, I see.
He claims that while the laws say they are gender neutral, the judges interpreting them still operate on a subconscious, overwhelming presumption of maternal innocence and paternal inadequacy.
And this leads to a psychological trap that Riker calls the double bind, which he says modern men face in romance and law. Society, media, and romantic partners constantly demand that men open up, communicate their feelings, and show vulnerability. But Riker points to some fascinating data suggesting this is a trap.
Yes, he cites a specific UCLA sociological study showing that when men actually do display genuine vulnerability, crying, expressing deep fear, or admitting weakness, it increases their romantic breakup rates by 23%.
23%. That's a massive penalty for doing exactly what they're told to do.
Riker argues that despite what modern feminism claims to want from men, women are biologically hardwired to be repulsed by male weakness. But the double bind gets much more insidious when it reaches the courtroom.
Right, because he claims this demanded vulnerability is actually weaponized against men. How does that mechanism work in family court?
According to Riker, if a man goes to therapy during a failing marriage to open up as his wife requested, his therapist's notes about his grief, frustration, or depression are frequently subpoenaed during the divorce.
That feels like a huge betrayal of trust.
It is. The wife's legal counsel will then use those very expressions of vulnerability as documented proof of emotional instability, arguing that the father is too psychologically fragile to maintain custody of the children.
So men are demanded to be vulnerable, punished romantically when they are, and then legally stripped of their children for having a documented emotional record.
Exactly.
He highlights several tragic, real-world anecdotes to underscore the human cost of this legal machinery. Let's talk about the story of James Miller.
James Miller was an Ohio father whose case Riker uses as a prime example of this systemic failure. According to the book, Miller meticulously documented 37 separate formal legal requests for simply equal 50-50 parenting time with his children.
The 37 requests.
He jumped through every hoop the court demanded. Yet, he was continually denied by a system that Riker describes as heavily favoring the mother. Ultimately, Miller lost his home, his savings to legal fees, and access to his children due to what Riker asserts were completely fabricated, last-minute abuse claims made by the ex-wife.
And those claims didn't need proof.
According to Riker, they required zero initial evidence to trigger a restraining order, effectively evicting Miller from his own life.
The stories get incredibly dark, leading to a grim statistical reality. Riker talks about a Detroit factory worker, a guy who worked the line, paid his taxes, did everything right, but he was hit with a court order demanding he pay half of his take-home pay in alimony to an ex-wife who was documented as schizophrenic and unable to work.
Right.
Faced with absolute financial ruin and the inability to afford even a basic apartment for himself, the man tragically took his own life in a courthouse parking garage. Riker notes that his suicide note explicitly mentioned his inability to escape alimony prison.
Riker links this tragic anecdote directly to CDC data, showing that men die by suicide at roughly 3.5 to nearly 4 times the rate of women.
4 times the rate.
Yes. And Riker aggressively pushes back on the mainstream narrative that male suicide is caused by toxic masculinity, preventing men from seeking help. Instead, he argues that the family court system, through financial extortion and parental alienation, is literally driving men to their deaths.
And if a man finds himself in a volatile situation at home, Riker argues the system is rigged against him before a judge even gets involved, specifically through something called the Duluth model. Let's do another ELI 5 here. What is the Duluth model, and why does Riker dedicate so much time to tearing it down?
The Duluth model is a highly influential framework used for domestic violence intervention, developed in Duluth, Minnesota in the early 1980s. It is heavily utilized to train police departments and shape domestic violence laws across the country.
How does it work?
The core tenet of the Duluth model is rooted in feminist theory. It posits that domestic violence is not caused by psychological issues, substance abuse, or relationship dynamics, but is instead fundamentally a tool of patriarchal control. Therefore, it assumes that in almost all cases, the man is the perpetrator, utilizing societal power to oppress the female victim.
But Riker brings in conflicting data regarding domestic violence rates, right?
Exactly. Riker cites epidemiological data suggesting that in non-reciprocal domestic violence, where only one partner is hitting women, are actually the instigators over 70% of the time.
70%.
Yet because police are trained under the Duluth model's assumptions, when officers arrive at a domestic disturbance, they are heavily predisposed to arrest the man. Riker details scenarios where a man will call the police because his wife is attacking him, but when the police arrive, they arrest the man.
Even if he's the one who called.
Even if he is the one with defensive scratch marks, because the Duluth framework dictates that he must be the underlying patriarchal aggressor.
If we take Riker's data at face value, you really have to consider how these models are actively shaping the lives of men today. If you are a man entering that system, Riker's premise is that the deck is stacked against you, operating on a presumption of male guilt. Here's where it gets really interesting. Riker argues that this presumption of guilt has metastasized out of family court and into the broader culture, leading to the weaponization of false accusations. He takes direct aim at the Me Too movement and the rise of Title IX campus tribunals.
Riker argues that these movements have effectively destroyed the concept of due process in Western society. He claims we have rapidly regressed to a guilty until proven innocent framework.
A complete inversion of the justice system.
In this new paradigm, he argues, a single anonymous tweet, an unverified accusation, or a campus rumor can permanently end a man's career, destroy his reputation, and ruin his life, with absolutely zero requirement for physical evidence.
And he doesn't just treat false accusations as a rare anomaly, which is often the counter-argument. He points to Department of Justice and FBI data that he claims shows 8% of rape allegations are provably, demonstrably false.
8% is a highly significant number in his view.
Right. He argues that 8% isn't just a statistical margin of error, When applied to the population, it represents thousands of innocent men targeted by what he specifically calls emotional terrorism. He says mainstream feminist organizations brush this off as collateral damage, but for the men involved, it's an absolute holocaust of their lives.
To cement this point, he dives deep into several high-profile historical examples where the media and the legal system colluded to destroy innocent men. The 2006 Duke lacrosse case is his primary anchor.
Yeah, that case was everywhere.
This is a vital case to understand Riker's worldview. 3 young collegiate athletes had their lives and reputations completely dismantled by a false claim of gang rape from a stripper named Crystal Mangum. What makes this case crucial for Riker is the behavior of the authorities.
Right, because the district attorney, Mike Nafon, aggressively pursued the case despite glaring inconsistencies. Walk me through the mechanics of how that case fell apart and why Riker uses it as proof of systemic bias.
Mike Nafong was up for re-election and faced a tight race. Riker argues Nifong utilized the accusation to pander to a specific political demographic, aggressively pushing the narrative of privileged, toxic, white male athletes abusing a marginalized woman.
He ignored the evidence.
He actively suppressed exonerating DNA evidence that proved the players were not involved. The media ran with the narrative for months, destroying the boys' lives. It took the intervention of the state attorney general to finally declare the players completely innocent.
And what happened to Nafong?
Riker notes that while the men were eventually clear, the traumatic damage was irreversible. Furthermore, Nafong served only a single day in jail for his extreme prosecutorial misconduct, and the accuser faced minimal initial consequences. Riker uses this to prove that the system actively rewards those who attempt to destroy men for political gain.
He also brings up the tragic story of Brian Banks. This was a high school football star with massive NFL dreams, a full-ride scholarship to USC waiting for him. But he spent 5 years in prison because a classmate named Juanetta Gibson entirely fabricated a rape story.
A terrible story.
Years later, she was secretly recorded admitting she lied so she could sue the school district, which she did, winning a $1.5 million settlement. Banks eventually fought to get his conviction overturned, but he lost 5 critical years of his physical prime, completely derailing his NFL career. Riker asks, where is the justice or the societal outrage for these men? Where are the marches for Brian Banks?
And Riker asserts that this weaponization is currently happening most aggressively within the university system. He spends significant time discussing the mattress girl case at Columbia University.
Emma Solkovich.
Yes. Emma Solkovich carried a heavy dorm mattress around campus for a year to protest a male student she accused of rape. Riker details how the accused student was cleared by the university's own Title IX investigation and cleared by the NYPD.
Why was he cleared?
Largely due to text messages demonstrating a continuous consensual relationship after the alleged event. Yet the university not only allowed Solkovich to continue her public shaming campaign, but they also gave her academic credit for the protest as an art thesis, and the media heralded her as a hero.
So the evidence didn't matter.
For Riker, this proves that objective reality and evidence mean nothing in the face of female victimhood narratives.
The threshold for ruining a male student's life on campus is incredibly low, according to his research. He cites a deeply unsettling case at the University of Michigan where a male student was expelled, losing his tuition, his academic record, everything based entirely on an ex-girlfriend's text message to a friend that simply said, "I feel uncomfortable."
Just that text.
There were no lawyers permitted during the tribunal, no cross-examination, no real evidence of any crime, just a subjective feeling treated by the university administration as absolute proof of misconduct.
It paints a chilling picture of campus life for young men. But Riker argues that this weaponization of feelings doesn't just start in adulthood or on college campuses. He traces this exact same mechanism back to early childhood education, which brings us to his analysis of the war on boys in the education system.
He expands his critique down to elementary school.
Yes, claiming that public schools have become feminized re-education camps.
That's a severe claim. Walk me through the exact mechanics he uses to justify the idea that a normal elementary school is a re-education camp pathologizing normal male energy.
He argues that the modern educational environment has been systematically engineered to reward female biological traits compliance, sitting still, verbal communication, and docility, while actively punishing male biological traits, competitiveness, physical energy, spatial exploration, and kinesthetic learning.
And he has data for this.
He points to grading bias data as his first line of evidence. He heavily cites a Johns Hopkins study that tracked middle school grading patterns.
Yes, I wanted to ask about that study. What exactly was the methodology there?
The researchers took exact identical writing samples and distributed them to teachers to grade. They found that teachers consistently marked the exact same writing sample a full letter grade higher if they were told it was written by a girl rather than a boy.
A full letter grade just for the name on the paper.
Riker argues this isn't just an unconscious quirk, it represents systemic, institutional academic discrimination against boys from the moment they enter the classroom. Boys are being artificially depressed in their academic achievements simply for being boys.
And he claims this academic discrimination directly translates into disciplinary action. He uses Department of Education statistics showing that boys receive a staggering 70% of all school suspensions. Now, a critic might say boys just misbehave more. How does Riker counter that?
Riker argues that what we call misbehavior is actually just natural male biology being criminalized. Behaviors natural to young boys, fidgeting, roughhousing, competitive play, building things, are labeled as toxic or routinely misdiagnosed as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Right. Riker points out the massive spike in prescribing amphetamines to young boys, arguing that society is heavily medicating young men just so they can sit completely still for 8 hours in a classroom designed for female learning styles.
And the long-term effect.
The ultimate result of this multi-decade suppression, he notes, is that men now earn only 40% of bachelor's degrees, effectively locking them out of the modern knowledge economy.
Okay, so we've talked about the data, but what does this actually look like in a real classroom? Does Riker give any concrete examples of the zero-tolerance policing of boyhood?
He does, and the anecdotes he selects are designed to provoke outrage. He details the case of an 8-year-old boy in Detroit who took apart a classroom clock to see how the gears worked.
Sounds like future engineer behavior.
Instead of being praised for his engineering curiosity and spatial intelligence, the boy was suspended, mandated to see a school psychologist, diagnosed with ADHD, and permanently labeled as a disruptive threat. Then there's the case of an Ohio 7th grader who was suspended under zero-tolerance violence policies simply for drawing a picture of a toy soldier holding a gun in his notebook.
A doodle.
Riker argues that the system views any expression of traditional masculinity, even a doodle, as an inherent threat that must be stamped out.
Moving back up to the university level, Riker argues that higher education purges any male intellect that refuses to comply with this ideology. He points to the expulsion of contrarian voices, like the evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College. Weinstein, a lifelong progressive, was forced off his own campus by mob threats simply for refusing to participate in a racially segregated day of absence. Riker also extensively references Dr. Jordan Peterson's rise to prominence, framing Peterson's early battles against compelled speech legislation in Canada as a desperate defense of male truth-seeking against the pathologization of traditional masculinity in academia.
This raises an important question, one that Riker asks explicitly. What are the long-term geopolitical implications of this educational strategy?
Right. This is happening everywhere in the West.
Riker points to reports of a Missouri school district forcing disruptive boys to wear empathy corsets, literal heavy vests meant to restrict movement and force emotional reflection, and keeping feelings journals. He contrasts this directly with rival nations like China.
What's China doing differently?
China is heavily reforming their educational systems to drill their youth in rigorous math, engineering, and physical combat drills, explicitly stating they want to increase the masculinity of their young men. Riker warns that if the West unilaterally disarms its next generation of men by forcing them into empathy corsets, while our geopolitical rivals train engineers and soldiers, the survival of Western civilization is mathematically doomed.
That is precisely the kind of systemic, big-picture extrapolation Riker excels at. He believes a civilization cannot survive if it demonizes the very masculine traits required to defend and maintain it. And this connects seamlessly to his analysis of the workplace.
The corporate castration section.
Let's transition to his thoughts on corporate environments, which he titles Corporate Castration and Male Disposability. He draws a very stark contrast between the air-conditioned HR departments obsessing over diversity quotas and the brutal, often fatal reality of blue-collar male labor.
This is where he hits the wage gap argument head-on, attacking what he sees as the core tenet of modern feminist economics. Riker claims the gender wage gap, the often cited statistic that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, is a complete statistical myth.
How does he debunk it?
He cites economists who point out that when you control for hours worked, specific career choices, willingness to relocate, and time taken off for child rearing, the gap virtually disappears, and in some urban demographics, young women actually out-earn young men. But Riker says, while society endlessly debates this mythical wage gap, it completely ignores the very real death gap.
Right. And he pulls Bureau of Labor Statistics data to back this up, showing that men account for a staggering 92% to 93% of all workplace fatalities.
Exactly. Men are the loggers, the roofers, the underwater welders, the oil riggers, the commercial fishers. They perform the hyper-dangerous, physically brutal tasks that keep the electricity on, the water running, and the supply chains moving.
The essential jobs.
Broker uses this data to unpack what he calls the disposable male syndrome. Society, he argues, relies absolutely on men to do the dangerous, dirty, and lethal jobs that keep civilization from collapsing, but offers them zero gratitude or societal power in return.
And how does corporate HR play into this disposability?
Riker characterizes modern corporate HR departments as ideological firing squads. He argues that these HR departments force the very men who generate the actual value for the company to sit through mandatory unconscious bias training seminars.
In these seminars, men are explicitly told that they are privileged oppressors, regardless of their actual socioeconomic background.
Right. Riker cites Harvard Business Review data suggesting that these mandatory diversity trainings are not only spectacularly ineffective at their stated goals, often reducing minority hiring, but they drastically spike resentment, anxiety, and disengagement among male employees.
Riker's claim is that this isn't just annoying, it's actually physically dangerous. He blames these diversity initiatives for real-world fatal disasters. He points to incidents like the Permian Basin oil rig disaster and a massive scaffolding collapse in Miami.
He connects those to HR.
Riker directly attributes these tragedies to companies prioritizing diversity hires and prioritizing inclusive safety protocols over raw, uncompromising physical competence and years of hard-won experience. His logic is brutal. When you lower physical standards to meet corporate quotas in a dangerous environment, the laws of physics take over and people die.
He also explores how corporate environments treat male dissent. He dedicates a section to the famous case of James Damore, the software engineer fired from Google.
The Google memo.
Damore's crime was circulating an internal memo that cited mainstream, peer-reviewed evolutionary biology and psychology to explain why there might be statistical gender differences in tech interests and leadership roles.
Yeah.
He wasn't arguing that women couldn't code. He was offering a biological explanation for the statistical disparities.
But HR didn't see it that way.
Riker argues that Damore was fired not for being factually wrong, but for stating objective biological facts that contradicted HR's deeply held feminist ideology that all disparities must be the result of systemic sexism. Damore was a sacrificial lamb to the HR apparatus.
And when Riker talks about the ultimate example of male disposability, he looks at the government level. He points out the sheer hypocrisy of the military draft, the selective service. He notes that 58,220 American men died in the bloodbath of the Vietnam War, drafted completely against their will, forced to fight and die in a jumble.
A staggering number.
Meanwhile, modern feminist organizations have fought tooth and nail in the courts to ensure women remained exempt from registering for the draft. Riker's conclusion here is biting. He says they demand absolute 50-50 equal representation in the air-conditioned boardroom, but are completely silent when it comes to equal representation in a muddy body bag.
It is a profound, glaring contradiction that Riker exploits to devastating effect. He argues that society demands male sacrifice, male protection, and male provision as a baseline expectation, but simultaneously demonizes male authority, male bonding, and male identity.
Which leads right into his next argument.
This dynamic, where ideology trumps reality and victimhood, is weaponized as a tool for financial and social power, is the primary focus of his next major argument, the victimhood industrial complex.
Riker really investigates the financial incentives behind all of this, what he calls the oppression gold rush. He argues that modern social justice activism isn't about equality at all. It's not a grassroots moral movement. It is treated as a highly profitable grift and a mechanism for corporate shakedowns.
Yes.
He says the people screaming the loudest about systemic oppression are often the ones getting extraordinarily wealthy off of it.
The examples he provides are meant to meticulously illustrate this financial exploitation. He points directly at Patrisse Cullors, the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter global network. Riker notes that while the organization brought in tens of millions of dollars in donations following social unrest, Cullors proceeded to purchase multiple luxury homes worth millions of dollars in predominantly white, affluent neighborhoods, while the organization's broader finances remained highly opaque.
It's treated as a franchise.
Riker frames this not as an anomaly, but as the intended feature of the system. Activism acting as a lucrative, tax-exempt franchise for the founders, rather than a mechanism for actual community uplift.
He also digs into the legal system with what he calls ADA lawsuit mills. Can you give us an ELI 5 on how these lawsuit mills actually operate, particularly regarding the website accessibility overlays he mentions?
Certainly. The Americans with Disabilities Act was designed to ensure physical access for disabled individuals. But Riker argues activist lawyers have weaponized the law into a protection racket.
How does that look in practice?
In the physical world, lawyers will drive through strip malls looking for slightly worn parking lines or mirrors hung an inch too high and immediately sue the small business owner, demanding a $12,000 settlement to drop the suit.
And on the internet.
The new frontier is digital. These law firms deploy bots to scan thousands of small business websites to see if they perfectly comply with complex visual impairment coding standards. If a mom-and-pop bakery's website isn't perfectly coded for screen readers, the firm threatens a massive lawsuit.
So they just extort a settlement.
The only way out is to pay a hefty settlement and buy expensive accessibility overlay software, often sold by companies with ties to the activists themselves. It's a systemic shakedown that produces no real-world benefit, but bankrupts small business owners.
Riker also targets major corporate virtue signaling. He argues that global brands exploit progressive ideology purely for marketing profit while engaging in highly unethical practices behind the scenes. He highlights Philip Morris selling LGBTQ+ inclusive branded cigarettes in Western markets to score ESG points, while knowingly selling highly addictive, deadly products.
This classic deflection.
He also points to Unilever, the massive conglomerate that runs the famous empowering feminist Dove soap campaigns telling women to love their bodies. Riker notes that while Unilever is winning awards for feminist marketing in New York, they are simultaneously exploiting female tea workers in Kenyan fields for pennies an hour under grueling conditions. He views this woke capitalism as a cynical smokescreen designed to distract from corporate rapacity.
And he traces this grift all the way down to the individual consumer level. One of the most fascinating micro examples he points out is the fake emotional support animal industry.
Oh, this one is wild.
Riker talks about online certificate mills, where literally anyone can take a 5-minute meaningless multiple choice quiz online, pay $50, and receive a laminated certificate declaring their untrained pit bull, or even a tarantula, as a legally protected emotional support animal.
A tarantula.
This allows individuals to completely bypass housing pet fees, breed restrictions, and airline safety rules. Riker frames this absurd situation as the ultimate manifestation of the captured mind, prioritizing an individual's subjective, unverified feelings over societal rules, physical safety, and basic common sense.
This relentless prioritization of subjective feelings over objective biological reality brings us to the culmination of Riker's argument. The final chapters of his book focus heavily on the fundamental attack on biology, and then, crucially, he lays out his specific blueprint for how men can fight back against this captured system. Let's start with the biology. Riker goes hard on the data here.
He does. He argues that the attack on masculinity isn't just cultural, it is chemical and biological. He points to the well-documented multi-generational collapse in male testosterone levels across the Western world.
A physical change.
While some attribute this to microplastics or diet, Riker argues that society is actively culturally engineering men to be more docile by pathologizing high testosterone behaviors. He brings up the massive medical scandal at the Tavistock Clinic in London.
What happened there?
Whistleblowers revealed that vulnerable autistic children were being rushed onto experimental puberty blockers with almost no psychological vetting, effectively chemically castrating young boys under the guise of gender affirmation.
And he views the transgender debate through a very specific lens regarding female erasure, right? He discusses Leah Thomas.
Yes, he extensively discusses Leah Thomas, the biological male who transitioned and subsequently dominated NCAA women's swimming, taking a national championship away from biological females.
How does Riker frame that?
Riker doesn't analyze this from a religious perspective. He sees it as the ultimate proof of his thesis. He argues that feminist ideology has become so unmoored from physical reality that it will literally erase biological women's hard-won athletic achievements and demand women smile and applaud while it happens, simply to maintain the ideological narrative that gender is an entirely malleable social construct.
Right.
For Riker, when a society allows a biological male with male bone density and lung capacity to physically dominate women in a pool, that society has lost its collective mind.
And the ultimate toll of this societal madness brings us back to that sobering statistic. Men die by suicide 3.5 to 4 times more often than women. Riker places the blame for this bloodbath squarely on modern therapeutic culture.
He says therapists are part of the problem.
He argues that modern therapists trained in these captured universities actively pathologize natural masculinity. They tell men that their stoicism, their desire to provide, their competitive drive, and their desire for physical space are all toxic. They force men to adopt a feminized vulnerability, which, as Riker previously established, society actually despises and legally weaponizes against them. Men are left completely isolated, told their very nature is a disease.
Which leads to the climax of the book. Riker doesn't just present 400 pages of doom and gloom, he offers a highly specific tactical response plan for men, which he titles the Remasculation Protocol.
So, what does this all mean? How does Riker say men should respond to an entire civilization that he claims hates them?
The first step in his protocol is psychological. He says men must absolutely and immediately stop apologizing for existing and stop apologizing for their masculinity. He advocates for a psychological defense mechanism called tactical indifference, also known in psychological circles as the gray rock method.
I want to understand how that connects to the family court issues we discussed earlier. How does the gray rock method actually work in practice?
Let's say a man is in family court or dealing with a highly antagonistic HR department. The opposing party, whether it's an ex-wife or a diversity officer, will often attempt to provoke an emotional reaction. They want the man to yell, to cry, or to show anger so they can document it and use it as proof of his instability or toxicity.
So, what does the man do?
Tactical indifference means the man becomes as unresponsive and uninteresting as a gray rock. He shows zero emotion. He speaks only in short, factual sentences. He does not defend his ego. By providing absolutely zero emotional fuel, he starves the manipulator of the reaction they need to weaponize against him. It is a brilliant stoic defense against a system designed to exploit emotional vulnerability.
Beyond the psychological tactics, Riker advocates for building entirely parallel physical and legal institutions. If the family courts are completely rigged, as he claims, he suggests men stop using them. He advocates for the use of blockchain custody contracts. Walk me through the mechanics of this. How can a decentralized ledger supersede state family law?
It's a radical technological workaround. Riker proposes that before having children, couples sign immutable, self-executing smart contracts on a blockchain network. These contracts dictate the precise terms of 50-50 custody and financial asset division in the event of a split.
So no judge is involved.
Because a smart contract automatically executes when certain conditions are met and the assets are held in decentralized cryptocurrency wallets, it completely bypasses the jurisdiction of a biased family court judge. A judge cannot freeze a decentralized wallet and cannot alter the blockchain record.
Is that even legally binding?
Riker admits the legal framework is still developing, but he views this as the ultimate technological rebellion against a captured legal system. If the state courts are corrupt, mathematically remove the state from the equation.
And what about the psychological isolation? If modern therapy is pathologizing men, where do they go?
Riker highlights groups like the Iron Brotherhood and the Men's Sheds movement, which originated in Australia and the UK. These are strictly male-only spaces.
Like support groups.
Crucially, men do not go to these sheds to sit in a circle, hold hands, and cry about their feelings. They heal side by side through shared physical labor. They do woodworking, fix engines, restore cars, and build physical infrastructure. Riker argues that men bond and process trauma not face to face, but shoulder to shoulder, working toward a common goal.
Rebuilding that baseline.
He claims that these localized physical brotherhoods have done more to organically drop the male suicide rate in their respective communities than any multi-million-dollar government-funded therapy program.
Finally, he tells men to hit the captured system where it hurts the absolute most, the wallet. He advocates for a total financial boycott. Withhold all financial support from woke media, cancel your Netflix subscriptions, avoid Hollywood blockbusters that routinely portray men as bumbling idiots or toxic villains, and pull your money out of ESG-compliant banks. He tells men to only fund independent creators, independent businesses, and parallel economies that explicitly respect male identity.
It is, at its core, a call for a complete, unapologetic withdrawal of male participation, male labor, and male capital from institutions that Riker believes are actively hostile to their existence. He couples this strike with a mandate to rebuild functional, merit-based, physically grounded structures from the ground up, returning to the ethos of the Detroit auto workers and the Spartan Negotiation.
Wow. We have covered an absolutely massive amount of ground today. From the meritocracy of the 1950s Detroit auto unions and the material science architectural critiques of Zaha Hadid, to the heartbreaking legal statistics of the family court system, the tragic reality of male workplace fatality rates, the ideological engineering in our elementary schools, and the digital rebellion of blockchain custody. Riker's Marxism in Knickers truly leaves no stone unturned in its systemic critique of modern Western civilization.
We have navigated a very dense, complex forest of historical data, legal precedents, and cultural analysis. By impartially laying out the architecture of Riker's thesis, we've explored his core argument that the very physical, cultural, and legal infrastructure of our society has been fundamentally and intentionally altered by these specific ideologies.
To you, the listener, we know exactly what you were looking for when you clicked play. You wanted a deep, multi-perspective dive into these intense cultural arguments. You wanted the raw data, the history, and the systemic mechanics without the mainstream fluff. Today, we provided a very thorough, unfiltered map of this specific, highly controversial, and deeply fascinating worldview.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a philosophical question inspired by the text, but looking beyond it to the future of our society. If Riker is correct in his underlying premise, that men, through brute force and physical sacrifice, built the physical infrastructure of civilization, and that they are now being actively alienated, legally stripped of their families, and culturally demonized by the very institutions they maintain, what happens if the builders collectively decide to embrace the author's final advice? What happens if the men who climb the scaffolding, rig the oil, and build the engines simply walk away? Can a modern society actually sustain itself on ideology, diversity quotas, and HR protocols alone, when the underlying physical and economic machinery requires the exact masculine traits that are currently being systematically suppressed?
That is a fascinating, terrifying question to mull over. What actually happens to the skyline when the people keeping the lights on decide to go home? Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. Please take a moment right now to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive. Once again, today was a review of the fascinating, ultra-long and incisive ebook, Marxism in Knickers. I strongly encourage you to go check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book for yourself. Dive into the data. And don't forget to follow the author at Conrad Donreicher at Substack. Until next time, keep diving deep.